Good afternoon. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Rachel Patton, Executive Director of Preserve Arkansas. Preserve Arkansas is the statewide nonprofit advocate for historic preservation. Welcome to Women in Preservation. This series features Arkansas women who are working to save the state's historic places. The program is generously supported by DMX Architecture in Fayetteville, so many thanks to DMX. Preserve Arkansas, I told you, is our state's nonprofit advocate for historic preservation. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization. If you'd like to learn more about what we do or become a member, visit us at preservearkansas.org and follow us on social media. I'd like to invite all of you to join us for an upcoming event. Preservation Crustaceans, Crawfish, and Shrimp Boil is coming to Argenta, the 2 North Little Rock's downtown historic district, on Saturday, April 30th from 6 to 8 p.m. Tickets are available now at preservearkansas.org. And join us next month on May the 10th for Women in Preservation. Our speaker will be Secretary Stacy Hurst of the Arkansas Department of Parks, Heritage, and Tourism. And now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Lori Yazwinski, Santa-Rita. Lori became a partner at Jennings and Santa-Rita Architects in Fayetteville in 2015. She served as the 2019 AIA Arkansas President, is a founding member of Women in Architecture Arkansas, and is currently working with the AIA National Strategic Council as the Arkansas representative. After graduating magna cum laude from the University of Arkansas in 2005, Lori was appointed to the City of Fayetteville Environmental Action Committee, and over the years has been involved in various nonprofits throughout the state. Lori's dedication to the profession of architecture and community service were recognized with the AIA Arkansas 2018 Emerging Professional Award. She was also included in the Northwest Arkansas Business Journal's 40 Under 40 in 2015 and featured in the 2019 publication of Women Make Arkansas. Lori enjoys being involved in various outreach initiatives using her craft to engage with others on the subjects of architecture and equity. Please welcome Lori Yazwinski, Santa-Rita.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be here. I've been very impressed with the diversity of speakers you all have had, and I'm happy to be a part of that. I'm gonna go ahead and start my screen, see how this goes. So,
looks good.
Let me see if I can. Give me a minute, sorry. All right, so I talked to Rachel about this earlier. I love preserving old buildings. It's a passion of mine for sure. I wouldn't put myself in that category technically, just because you all probably know a lot more about preservation than I do. But I am in a unique position where I've had the opportunity to learn about this particular office from that started with Faye Jones, and I'll kind of go into the legacy and the timeline of the whole office. But I kind of want to talk more about the preservation of the ideas and concepts that the studio has espoused over the last several decades, and how that work and has influenced the work we do now, and kind of continuing the legacy of ideas. Faye has a huge legacy. He had so many different students. He was the dean of the School of Architecture for several years, and so there are a lot of people out there who have learned from him and had the opportunity to kind of to continue that work, and we're just a small facet of that, but I'm proud to be a part of it. So the office as it is now is myself, Walter Jennings, and Rachel German. We are adding another person this summer, which is very exciting. We're very busy. We have all kinds of different projects we're working on right now, mostly houses, but we're also working on small commercial projects. We work with several botanical gardens on small projects, boutique projects. We do have a large housing project coming up that we're excited about, but for the most part, we do residential, and we have done some chapels. I've done a lot of lectures. I've never done one on this particular topic. I have done one. This was a Pecha Kucha presentation I did about basically the lack of representation within the profession. The Rays are the women and the Lukes are the men. We're all in the same force though. Sorry. And then I've also done presentations on Little Free Libraries. I worked with the Ozark Literacy Council. I had local architects and artists design and fabricate little free libraries that were installed all over Fayetteville. We had a lot of participation and community outreach and involvement in that. Marlon Blackwell designed a library, and then this is Marlon's library. This is Moda Studios library. My husband did this one. It's in front of Washington Elementary School. The school, the Faye Jones School of Architecture also participated, and this was one a student did, and it's still in front of Whole Foods in Fayetteville. Skiles Architects, and then this was actually another student library. So I like to be involved in different organizations and kind of connect the design community with the general population, I guess you could say, and educate people about what good design is and how it can benefit our spaces and our cities. But this is where it all began. I feel like this picture basically sums up what it feels like being in the architecture program. I'm a 2005 alumna of the School of Architecture. This was my third year. I had done a relief plaster cast of a facade of a building and had spent hours taking this very fragile plaster cast out of its mold. And you can see the remnants of the mold around it. And I just kind of basically collapsed out of exhaustion. But it was a great, experience, and I'm happy to have gone through it. It was also around this time where the first and only time I met Faye Jones. He was signing posters at the De Palma Clinic, and which is across from what was the old city hospital. And there were 300 of these posters. And so people bought tickets and then they waited in line forever to have Faye sign their poster. And so I got up to Faye and he signed my poster, and he spelled my name wrong, which I'll admit, Lori Yazwinski is complicated, but he misspelled Lori and he spelled it Lorie. And Gus was there, his wife was there at the time, and she kind of corrected him a little bit. And I'll admit, I'd waited for a while and I was a little upset. But now when I think back about it, they only made 300 of these posters. And I am one of the 300 who had their name misspelled. So I feel like mine is, very unique in that respect. And as is par for the course, I put it somewhere very, very safe that not even I can find it. I know I do have it somewhere, but anyway, this was the poster. Has some furniture, and actually this is Maurice's house, and then the table, and then I think this is a gate. So anyway, that was my one and only in-person experience with Faye. So by no means do I consider myself a Faye expert in that respect. But like I said before, I've had the opportunity to work in the office, to study the work, to study the details, to study the ideas. And so in that respect, I feel like I've learned him or met him through that. This is just some work I did through school. I was really obsessed with light and craft and building things. This is actually 3 32nd-inch squares filled with watercolor. It's supposed to be a kind of a abstract map of sorts. But the school is a great place to learn about different crafts, and there's such a diversity of professors and you learn a lot and pick up a lot of, I was happy to, sorry, to be educated through the school. And then I carried it through after I graduated. These are just some small projects I worked on, either with my husband or by myself. I'm really obsessed with wood, kind of part of the business. I built a bench for my friend. This was an old, this one was an old record cabinet that I found on the side of the road, and I brought it home, and my husband and I turned it into a digital music player. I diddly-dallied in jewelry, and then I made a bench for my son when he was about 2 or 3 years old. But kind of the overarching scheme is craft and repurposing. Some of the wood was recycled wood that I had found. So I've kind of always been within that vein. Just kind of lay out the basic timeline of the office, because I know that not everybody is familiar with how the office, or at least Jennings Santa-Rita, has evolved over time. As you all know, Faye attended the University of Arkansas at the time when there were a few architecture classes within the School of Engineering. After a few years, he joined the Navy, but then came back. And by the time he came back in 1946, John Williams had established the architecture program. So Faye graduated in 1951 and started his practice in 1953. And then he was also dean around that time. Marie started working for Faye in 1973 and became an associate in 1976. In 1986, he became a named partner. So it's Faye Jones, Maurice Jennings, and then in 1997, Faye retired, and the name of the office changed to Maurice Jennings, Dave McKee. And then I went to Maurice Jennings in 2005, and then in 2011, Maurice Jennings, Walter Jennings, and then 2015 is when I became partner, and then we changed the name in Jennings Santa-Rita Architects in 2016 after Maurice had passed. So here is the office as it was in 1973 about. We have Maurice, John Womack, Al Japp, Faye Jones, and Mike Walden. We are still in that same office, and honestly, it hasn't changed that much. We still have the asbestos tile flooring, which hopefully we're going to be remediating soon. We still have all of the drafting boards, the original furniture and filing cabinets. And so it really is kind of a little preserved space. And if anybody was ever in the area, you are welcome to come up and check it out. There's a lot of really neat little details that we like to talk about. And this is the office as it is now. Well, close. So as you can see, we still have the drafting boards. We still do hand drawings. We love to hand draw. Since I have been in the office, and since Walter's been in the office as well, we have gone through hand drawing. We have done 2D AutoCAD. We have done Revit, which we are working in now. So just even kind of working through those different mediums has provided us a lot of experience and kind of feeling as though we were part of the history of the office. And you also learn a lot. You have to be very deliberate when you hand draw. You have to know exactly what you're drawing. And then with, it kind of evolves over time. And then 2D AutoCAD makes it a little bit easier as far as that goes. And then Revit is its whole other business. But it really helps you understand space. I'll have to admit, just kind of learning how to draw two-dimensionally in a plan and then moving to an elevation rather than modeling something really helps you understand kind of the implications of what you're designing and how it works with other aspects of the building. Revit does make it a lot easier, but sometimes I think it can be handicapping in a way. So I think that that's been a very valuable experience in my history in the office. So I'm going to talk briefly about Faye projects that you are very familiar with, I am sure. I'm not going to tell you anything you don't already know. Might be able to show you some pictures that you haven't seen before, but there are a lot of lessons that can be taken from Faye's project and the projects that the office has created over the decades. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the evolution of ideas and how we kind of use these ideas in our work now. So Thorncrown Chapel, so you might have heard of it, Eureka Springs. So what's amazing about Thorncrown is that there was such an emphasis on preserving the site. The chapel is set amongst the trees, which is one of the reasons that is so amazing. But part of that was, how do you build a building in the middle of the forest without just cutting down trees and disturbing everything? And so the most of the materials were all taken in by, what two people could carry. They used the footprint of the building to fabricate each of the bents. And so the bents are kind of a series of structural elements. They work on their own, but then they connect together to, hold it all together. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But each of the bents is also created with basic building materials. I mean, it's built up 2x4s and 2x6s that are detailed in a beautiful way that creates something really extraordinary. These images you can see, here is the bends being put together. Here is a basic wall section. So you can see it's just milled pieces. This is the structural column, which is a 2x4 sandwiched by 2x6s, and then a dentelated piece of trim on the ends. And then this image, which is probably one of my favorites, the structure just blends in with the trees. I think that is just a quintessential aspect of the work. And then these images are before the roof is put on. So you can see it's just really quite remarkable how that geometry works out, and kind of the efforts that were put in to preserve that site. You've all seen these images, I'm sure, maybe not this one of Faye, which I find beautiful just because you see the dappled light, and I think it just kind of sets him within his element with the trees behind him. But it's really remarkable during the time of day, how it changes during the time of year, how those shadows change. And so that's also like a large idea that we play with, is this idea of designing with light. We don't just design with materials, but we think about the way the light plays with those materials, as well as how we use the structure to emphasize the shadows and the light. And then blurring the inside with the outside. I think this image shows it pretty well, where you kind of look through the structure and see the trees. There's almost no difference between the two. And so that whole idea of blurring the inside and the outside, celebrating the structure, and designing with light are a few ideas that we take from these types of projects and use them now. Cooper Chapel is personally one of my favorites. I just love the shape of it and the steel structure. What's interesting about Cooper Chapel to me is that the C-channel vents were fabricated by White Listening Racing in South Fayetteville. They did dirt track racing, and they had equipment to bend the channel the hard way. So you can imagine a C-channel. You can bend it one way pretty easily, but it's structurally built so that it's more difficult to bend the other way. And Cooper Chapel is a series of C-channels backed up against each other with a bit of a spacer. And so you get that relief there. It adds detail and texture and shadow. And then these pieces, this is on the inside, these pieces were bent up like that. These are smaller channels. And then they have this, call it a paddleboard detail over here. And so there's just a lot of texture within the details. So it's not just about the shape or the form necessarily, but it's how all the different pieces come together to make a composition, which is, we used to call it being cut from the same bolt of cloth. So every element is designed and detailed in a way that it complements the others, it elevates them, it makes sense, it fits the design. And so that's something that we try to maintain in our office now, is this idea of details and texture and how everything should kind of complement and work together. One other thing that's interesting is that Faye, all of the steel is powder coated, and Faye would take inspiration from cars, color of cars at the time. And so that car in the corner is inspiration for the color of Cooper Chapel. It is a 1968 Pontiac saddle bronze. And so that was kind of a lot. If you see a lot of the old Faye buildings with that bronze color, it is probably that particular type of that particular color. So remember that Pontiac saddle bronze. I also love pine coat. I'm really just talking about the projects I love. Sorry, you're just going to listen to me babble about projects I love for a minute. But I found this building is very simple. It's a pavilion. It's post and beam construction. Just like Thorn Crown is used with basic framing materials, used in extraordinary ways. And the use of light, I think, is probably the most profound thing to me with this project. You can see how the way it's detailed and the way that this roof becomes translucent and then dithers out to just the framing members, I find really remarkable. And then setting up this pattern of structure. So we have these verticals of the columns, and then it becomes the verticals of the trees. And it's just like a natural, just kind of bleeds into the environment, which I find so beautiful. And then in the reflection, you kind of get a little bit of that underside, which I think is really nice, kind of being able to see both of those in one image. Same here. This was uplit for the most part, which is why that the structure's so emphasized, which I also really enjoy. Just a few more images. You can see just kind of when you look at it from the front, it just looks very simple, just columns and cross bracing. But it's really kind of a remarkable composition and the way it works within the landscape, which was a preserved strawberry field, I believe. It's a reclaimed strawberry farm that's been transitioned into a coastal forest with trails and recovered wetlands. So just kind of the whole idea of the Pine Cove Pavilion and its environment is pretty great. So I don't know if many of you would be familiar with the Lindsay Wilson Chapel, John B. Begley. So a lot of people know Faye for his wood structures and steel, obviously, but he also had some really interesting masonry buildings, this being one of them. One of the ideas that we also try to preserve is honesty of materials, and the way, you know, there's a saying, which is the material want to be? Is that Alvar Aalto? I can't remember. Sorry. But what does the brick want to be? What does the brick want to do? And this chapel is also interesting because there aren't any windows. The only light is from the oculus above. So it's very internally oriented. It's on a busy campus, and so there weren't necessarily views. So they're trying to kind of create a spiritual space without distractions that it introduces light and texture. And as you can see, the dome was kind of produced in panels and then fabricated, all, you know, kind of put all together and put on top of the building. The dome was actually fabricated in Fayetteville. But I just love the way that the brick was used and the way the light was used as well. You don't have to always have windows in order to have beautiful light. And this is Maurice's house, which I really think embodies a lot of the ideas that we talk about in the office and that we have kind of developed on our, help kind of develop into our own in a way. Like I said, just using the materials as a detail. You don't even necessarily have to have a lot of detailing, but just having the honesty of materials, the grain of the wood that beautiful reddish color. And then the way it's used at a diagonal adds a lot of texture and kind of creates a geometry that you wouldn't necessarily have otherwise. And then also on the inside, allowing light to come into the space to accentuate the texture of the materials. So the stone is lit above from a ridge skylight, as you can see here. And so you get all that beautiful texture of the stone coming down and some nice light. And then in the bedroom, which is on the other side of the fireplace, there's an opening in the floor that allows for the light to shine through from above. And so you get all of that light washing onto that stone. This is an opening up into the loft above. There aren't many doors in this house. It's very open, which is something also very interesting, I think, about a lot of the architecture, is that there's not necessarily walls and different rooms, but there's the implication of space through the architecture. So, you know, a low ceiling could be a bedroom where the high ceiling is the living room, but they could, you know, or an office, vice versa. So just kind of implying that a space exists, not necessarily through a wall or a door, but through the architecture of the space. I also really like the blurring of lines from inside and outside, like we talked about before. I can't tell you how many times I've seen people walk into this window. It's really hard to see that it's there when you're in the house, which is really, really nice when you're sitting by that window. You feel like you're outside. And then the chapel at Garvey Gardens. This was actually one of the first projects I worked on in the office. I worked in the office a couple of times in the summers when I was in school. And I was given the job of drawing out and measuring and quantifying every single piece of glass in the chapel. There is some controversy about a miscount. I'm not going to get into it. Depends on who you talk to, what story you get, but it was a bit tedious. But I learned a lot. You know, there's a lot of pieces of glass in this structure. You know, there's not, these mullions are there for a reason. They divide the glasses. They're not there for decoration. The other thing I worked on was I think I spent like 2 weeks on a downlight for the ceiling, and they ended up not using it, which is fine. It looks great. Everything's great. But what's interesting about this is it's also an evolution of kind of the idea of thorn crown, where thorn crown had the bents, and then in between the bents was what we call a discontinuous connector, which is right here. You can see there's kind of a bit of an opening where the pieces meet. But this, instead of being kind of two-dimensional, it's a little bit more three-dimensional. So instead of just having the pieces come together like this, sorry, I'm using my hands, they come together at an angle, which makes the geometry a little bit more complex. But here's kind of a detail showing you what that might look like. You can see the columns are at an X, and so the cross bracing comes up, and then it meets the other piece on the other side. And so here is one of those discontinuous connectors. You can kind of see how complex the geometry was. When we worked on this project, we were still in drafting things by hand, which, if you can imagine, drawing things three-dimensionally can be quite complicated. So in this case, I believe Walter actually convinced them to use 3D CAD to develop that so that we could understand that geometry a little bit better. When we gave it to our metal fabricator, he initially tried to make something that didn't have some of the complex geometry and angles and tried to shift it. It didn't work. But anyway, so it was kind of evolving the details, evolving the technology we use to communicate those ideas, and also just kind of how beautiful that is, having the structure come to a point where there's an opening, and how that plays with the light and the lightness of the entire building. So the Hunt Memorial Chapel was built in 2013. This was built on the Hunt Memorial Gardens, which is technically a cemetery, but the building is purposed for funerals, weddings, celebrations of life, basically anything anybody could want to do in a chapel like this. And so part of what we had to do was work with the view. How do you create a chapel that's used for weddings that also looks out on a cemetery? I'll admit, Circle of Life, very beautiful, but if you want to have a wedding, that might not be what you're looking for. And so we have these series of, so the bents are more opaque. So these are the bents, I'd say these are the stone bents, and they only have these openings on the side that look out either way, not towards the cemetery itself. There is an end window that looks out, but for the most part, it's looking out onto the grounds rather than the cemetery itself. And like I mentioned before, talking about how everything is cutting from the same bolt of cloth, the Hunt Chapel is a meditation on the circle. So like I said, the circle of life. So using that geometry throughout with the window design, we have rose windows, the wall sconces, and then even the sign that we did is all kind of a repetition of that, building up on this theme and this geometry and having them all kind of work together in a way. So on the interior, you can see that there's a lot of really beautiful lighting. So even at night, we underlight the pews, just kind of make sure that the surfaces, all of that beautiful texture, that stone flooring, the stone in the walls, all of that is expressed in a way that you can really appreciate the values of those materials. And also what is really interesting about the Hunt Chapel is that all of the stone arches are structural arches. They were framed up, they were laid stone by stone, they were framed until they were set, and then we removed the framework and hoped that it would stay. And they did a beautiful job, but I don't know many buildings that have functional stone arches, but that's kind of what we talk about when we talk about the honesty of materials and celebrating the structure. There is steel in that wall and some insulation, but the stone is what's holding that arch up. And so I have a detail of it here, and then there's a gusset in the middle. And so the Hunt Chapel is a bit more open than the other chapels. There's not a lot of cross bracing in there because the stone is really what kind of makes it. And it's the idea of permanence. It's supposed to be there in perpetuity. However long that cemetery is going to last, we want this building to last as long as well. And we want people to be able to use it and enjoy it. And so part of that was the permanence of the stone. Another detail we have, which and this has been something we still do, we've always done in the past, is do site-built windows. We usually don't do manufactured windows. We will frame up and trim one side of the window, set the glass in, and trim the other side. So it helps kind of with the idea of the blurring from the inside to the outside. And the light is really nice. Also, there's no way you could actually do these mullions without having them custom built. And this was it's a dressing building for the Hunt Chapel. And so the idea is that we want to, like I said, speak the same language, but since it's not the chapel, we don't want to distract from the chapel. And so we use similar materials with a very different form. We really intend on form in addition to all the other ideas we use. And so when you look at the chapel, it's a chapel. When you look at this building, it's probably an office or what it is an office and two dressing buildings on either side. And since we needed to have privacy, obviously, because people are getting dressed, we created these battered stone walls and then had an upper story glass window supported by mullions only. And so it kind of gives this effect of that whole roof floating. And you can kind of see the light through it. I think it's a really beautiful effect. And then a copper fascia, which shows weathering. And so I just really enjoy this building. Rio Roca Chapel, 2014. This is in Texas. A lot of ideas that we've talked about in previously, this idea of light and celebrating structure. The other interesting thing about this is controlling the views. Like I mentioned on the Hunt Chapel, there was a barn across, this is the Brazos River in Texas. There was a huge barn and I think chicken houses and things over on this side. And so what we wanted to do is we wanted to enjoy the view of the Brazos, which is incredibly beautiful, but not necessarily see those other buildings. So we brought the roof down quite low so that when you're on the inside, all you see is the river. We integrated lights like we had on several of the other chapels, custom wall sconces, a lot of texture. But I think the structure is probably one of the more interesting things. Here's that, the look down on the Brazos River where you can't see the buildings beyond it. Blurring that inside from outside. You know, if you're standing here, you really feel like you're standing on the edge, about to fall over. The other thing I will touch on briefly is integration of systems and how we treat things like HVAC and lighting and plumbing. And so you can see the supply grills here, and then the return air is actually integrated into the stone wall on the other side. We removed grout from areas and had a plinth, basically. And so here's the structure of Rio Roca. It's a series of vents, like I mentioned before, but it's a tension rod with turnbuckles. So these turnbuckles are threaded on either side, as you can see, and then attached to this diamond, steel diamond. And so that's what kind of holds that whole roof together. You know, when we work on things like this, we go through the design process and we propose something to an engineer, and we do have an engineer look at things and help us size things. But this is also the columns and the other structure are a flitch plate. So the steel is actually sandwiched in between wood because we needed basically wood to be able to kind of trim the glass and everything. And so also using the materials in a way that they're meant to be used. So steel is very good in tension. So there's a lot of tension in the steel. Wood is very good at compression. So it serves as the columns. So really understanding the materials, like I said, what do they want to be, and using them to our advantage in that way. The other interesting story about this is that the steel was actually fabricated in Fayetteville by Iron Man Fabrication, who we use a lot, David Davidian, and he built all of these vents in his shop. He brought them down to Texas and he installed them himself. And while he was installing them, he was tightening the base plates to the stone wall right here. And I think the first one he started tightening, one of the bolts in the concrete popped out, which is not supposed to happen. Typically, what we do is we set the base plates, the screws, into basically a rebar cage within the wall. And so he calls us up and he says, you know, I think we have a problem here. And so we kind of look back at photos because we try to take a lot of photos during the construction process so that we, you know, when things get covered up, we know what was there. And we saw that there was rebar there. So we were really confused by the problem. So we decided to do a destructive test, as you would say, which means like removing part of the building to understand, well, what's underneath it. Come to find out that there had been rebar there, but either the plumber or the electrician ended up cutting it off above the wall so that these plates weren't sitting within the rebar cage. So they had done the work. They just kind of gone backwards a little bit. This is the Rogers residence, which was completed in 2016. It's a very simple home built for a single couple. We were tight on the budget, and so we made certain design decisions early on. So we kept the footprint simple. So basically it's a square or rectangle. But then at these little bump outs, we use this cantilever detail in order to create storage and a little bit of interest. And then you can see that, as I kind of mentioned before, the idea of implying space from things like ceiling articulation or lighting or really any type of, difference in materials. We lowered the ceiling in the areas that were the transition spaces. And so in the living room, and then there's a little pop-up in the middle of the hallway, and then in the bedroom, you get these higher ceilings that you can really enjoy those spaces. Kind of, you're led through the hallway into those. Here are several images. It's a simple shed roof, metal roof. The site is right next to the Rogers Airport, and so we're trying to kind of turn our back to the airport, sloping the roof up towards the view, which is a really wonderful gully. As you can see, it has a bunch of dogwoods. And then we exposed the glulam beams, which I think was the first time we had ever tried doing this, rather than wrapping them in trim, which has been previous practice in the office. And what's really nice is you get the texture of the glulam, you get the honesty of that material. And then I don't have any good images of it, but the way we trimmed around the windows ended up being another really beautiful aspect of the detailing on this project. And they did a great job detailing that and building that. But we also, we love this. This is hardy board, which, we use hardy board. It's very economical and it's easy to maintain. So we used the hardy board and painted it a dark gray, but then used the wood and these steel elements to bring some warmth to it. So it has some really nice contrast to it. Here's some more details. Like I said, we like to detail every single aspect of the building to make sure that everything works together. So this is the wall sconce out in the front, kind of emphasizing the horizontals of the building itself. Here's one of those pop-ups I was talking about with the lowered ceiling and then a cove that kind of draws your attention to this little opening where you can see out into the gully. Across from this is the guest bedroom that has a sliding door where they can leave it open and use it as a music room as well. Here's that cove detail popping up. Just think it's really beautifully graphic. The hardy board, we miter the corners, which is not a typical detail for the hardy board and was a bit challenging at times, but it was worth it to get that texture right there. And then also kind of tactility is something we think about as well. On the inside, we didn't have door pulls yet. So we developed this detail of using strips of leather attached to the door pull hardware on the other side. There's a custom door pull on the other side that the hardware pokes through. So using that to create these door pulls. Here's the master bedroom. So you can see the higher ceilings, also the detail where we bring the glass all the way to the floor as much as we can, really blurring the inside and the outside. The glass is recessed into the gyp as well. So you really feel like you're out in the forest. This is a project that's under construction, so I don't have a lot of images of it just yet. But I wanted to kind of talk about some of the ideas we've already mentioned and talk about how it kind of keeps influencing our work. And so, sorry, I'm right on Dixon Street. I don't know if you can hear the motorcycles going by. But the blurring of the inside and the outside, using this detail where we mock up an opening in the stone. And then you can see that the horizontals of the stone, these stones are pieces that were cut to accept the glass. So when the glass is inserted in there, it just looks like a continuation of that material. And then using light to light that texture and getting those shadows. This is at the fireplace, and we have something we do a lot of is using like a cricket skylight or something at the fireplace, a skylight, or even just artificial lights, canned lights to light that texture. And so that's another thing we do is rather than lighting space, we don't try to light space, we light surfaces. We think you get kind of more bang for your buck, you get the reflection of the surfaces, you get to emphasize the architecture, and lighting spaces kind of always ends up being awkward, especially if they're not like a task lighting, if you're not needing it for like a kitchen or something where you need that. We really like lighting the spaces, which is kind of part of the integration of the systems I mentioned before. And then every time I go, I take a picture of this stairway because I just can't get enough of it. The client felt like the stairway was dark and wanted a skylight. And so we had talked about putting a skylight in the ceiling and thought that, rather than just putting a skylight in the ceiling, if we make it a sliver skylight and then it lights that entire surface, you get all of this beautiful light coming down. It almost looks like it's glowing. And then during certain times of day, you get just a beautiful sliver of light. It's an open staircase, goes down into the basement. So really just, I'm probably going to repeat myself talking about themes a lot of times, but like I said, this is the preservation of ideas. This was just a fun project we did for CASA, which is a court-appointed attorneys nonprofit in the area. And just thinking about the client, who's the client here? It's a kid. So what does a kid like? Well, a kid likes to hide. And so, well, let's make it a little fort underneath. But a kid also likes to get up high and look around. So let's make it a platform as well. And then what if we also put monkey bars in part of it, and then they could climb up? And then using light in a different way. This is a laser cut stainless steel panel that was inspired by some geometry. But just kind of a fun project, really nice little detailing here and there. Love the play of color. We typically don't paint things like this, but just kind of felt like it was a special project that deserves something a little different. So I'll talk a little bit about preservation, which is, guess why I'm here. This was the Palone residence. It was built in 1976. We went in 2013 and talked to the owner and worked with the owner on kind of reinstating some of the previous ideas and values, as well as modernizing it so that people could use it. That's something I'm a big proponent of. Is I want to preserve buildings, and part of preserving buildings for me is making sure that they are usable. If they're not being used and being enjoyed, then I don't necessarily feel like they're being maintained. And so it's really hard to preserve buildings that aren't usable. And so talking to the client and determining kind of what their needs are. But part of it was that the previous owner had come in and put these columns and gutters on the corner of this beautiful cantilever. They're not structurally required. I think that part of the impetus behind it was that the rain was coming off of the roof and eroding that deck away, which we ended up replacing anyway with something a bit more substantial. So we came in and we had those columns removed, which just makes a huge difference. You wouldn't think something like that would make a huge difference, but we don't use gutters, and we don't try to use columns in that way. And you can see that it's gone back kind of to the original intent. There's some of the original drawings of the home. Really unique house, has these wild triangular spaces, which was another part of something we had to work on, was that everything was 1/4 inch single pane glass, which is in my office. And so going back and using insulated glass, which can be a challenge because a lot of these openings are just too big for insulated glass. You're kind of limited by the size of glass panels you can use. So we had to come in and add some mullions and kind of work with the original geometry of the building in order to break these glass pieces down a little bit so that we could put insulated glass in there. And then they also had put tile on the floor. which we removed. And then what was really nice is that there were the original soft scores in the concrete. So a lot of the buildings faded, which you'll see in the next slide. And we still do this. We still use a grid system. So we use a 32-inch grid, which is based off of the basic measurements of building materials. So, studs are 16 inches on center, CMU is 8 by 16, just kind of playing off that. And so it helps with the economy of materials, kind of how the materials end up working together, as well as understanding space. There's just something very nice about designing in those increments. And so when you need to make something bigger or longer, you're not just arbitrarily making it bigger or longer. You kind of have a method or a framework, as you will. So the other preservation project I'll talk about is the Underwood's jewelry, which we're still constantly working with them. And like I mentioned before, the part of what we do is trying to make the space usable for the client so that it can be maintained and used and enjoyed. And in this case, they had, as you might know, the history of the building. Originally, Underwood's was in one half of the building at the lower level, and then the other half was a man's clothing store, I think. And so at one point, they took over the men's clothing store and expanded into that other space, but it didn't necessarily work with what they were trying to do. And so what they wanted to do was they have this right here, which is where they were checking out. Sorry. People were confused about where, technical difficulties. Kind of confused about where they should check out, and it was kind of a dark area. So we maintained the detailing. We were very sensitive about how we opened up the space a little bit more, kept the fins with the mirrors, kept the same, these are the exact same countertop details with this sloped edge, trying to make it bright so that when people were using the space, they knew where they should check out. Another aspect of this was it's a jewelry store. And so part of selling jewelry is displaying it well and lighting it. Things look better when they're sparkly. And so we designed and built this, we'll call it a trough light, which is kind of freestanding, that worked with the original details. You can kind of see how some of the lighting works in the space, which I find very interesting. So these is all of the electricals running through these coves, and then this trim is carrying it through these lights as well. So use that same idea in getting electrical to this trough. And when you go down in the space, you can see there's trough lights everywhere. You really don't notice that it's out of place, but it lights this so much better than it previously had. How am I doing on time? Sorry. Oh, goodness. I'm going to go through a little bit quicker. So now we'll kind of talk about, these are some funny pictures. So everybody probably knows about the picture with Maurice and Faye at Sky Rose Chapel. Walter and I were just having fun and did a replica photo. Not that we're ever comparing ourselves to those geniuses, but just having some fun. And, it's nice to preserve the history of the office. So this is a house that was built in kind of South Fayetteville. We don't have a lot of finished images of it because it's still, we're just waiting for the landscape to grow in. But so the clients originally owned a home designed by Herb Fowler on this exact site. Unfortunately, due to really geological issues, the house was falling apart. The foundation was cracking in a lot of places, and it just really wasn't maintainable, and there was really no way to go back and fix it. So we ended up having to remove that building and design them something on that same site. And so, as is the case when you have a challenging site, we had a very robust foundation that had about 26 piers inside of it. Really making sure that our buildings last, which is something that the office has always done. A huge emphasis on craftsmanship and longevity and leaving a legacy of what's, But there were a lot of salvageable aspects of the home that we were able to incorporate into this house. So there was a wood slat ceiling in the original home, and then we incorporated it into a wood slat ceiling above the kitchen island. And then also taking those wood slats and, like I mentioned before, integrating the system. So this is actually a return air grate above the doorway. And then these pendant lights were original to the building, repurposing those, putting them over the staircase so that they have pretty prominent view, really bringing in those older elements. We love this idea of wabi-sabi, which is this really clean, finished product next to something that's more natural and rougher, kind of working on that dichotomy. And then light, like I mentioned before, can't design without light. So this is their shower, which during different times of the day looks very different. We put another one of those skylights that washes the wall in it. Scoring the concrete into the grid so that all of the architectural elements line up with the grid on the floor. And then even just a simple window expressing the glulam beam above it gives it a lot more interest and warmth, especially when it's a south-facing window. This is the Garden Gardens room. This is hopefully going to be built soon. Really playing on the ideas of light and celebrating the structure. This is on top of Old Brick Hill, if you've been in Garden Gardens. So the brick path of Old Brick Hill was one of Verna Cook Garvin's original paths that she created in the 1950s. So the pavilion uses a similar brick pattern to what's on Old Brick Hill, and then has a series of vents, like I mentioned before, on a repetitious pattern that kind of dithers towards the center. So it creates that kind of the limits or the ends of the building, but then opens up towards the center. So it feels a little bit more enclosed. And then wood cross ties that have some linear lights incorporated in them. So you can see that we have to, design these vents to have the lights go up. And then these are, C channels using ordinary materials in extraordinary ways with a tension rod that ties it all together. And then we spent, I don't even know how many days, maybe 2 full days, working out this brick wall pattern so that each of those tie rods ties into somewhere that makes sense in that brick. Just getting in the weeds. That's how we like to do it. This is just a fun conceptual design. We don't do a lot of competitions like this, but we really like the program. And so we kind of thought about working with CLT and heavy timber to design a cabin out in the woods. And so, you can see the expression of the structure and how that is a huge part of the design. And this is a kind of a preservation project. This is an old pump house in Bentonville that was built in 1954. It has a very thick concrete foundation. It was actually the sole source of clean water for the people of Bentonville until 1963. And then it was sat vacant until the 60s when it was renovated as part of the Head Start initiative founded by President Lyndon B. Johnson. It was a child care center until 2014. And so all of the original piping is still visible in the project. There's a large turbine that's underneath one of the floors that was framed over. It's massive and really interesting. And we were trying to find a way to integrate that, doing like a glass floor so that you can actually really appreciate the history of the building. But we're still working through getting bids on this one. But here's the original plan. You can see here's where the turbine was. They had renovated this part to be a kitchen. And then all of these were closed spaces. So you can see here's the original exterior wall. And then this was open. But when we got to it, it was framed in. And so part of the design that we're hoping to do is to actually open up that corner that was closed in so that you can see the inside and outside, blurring that line. Engaging with the back of the building, which is tied into the bike trail up there, which could be a really great opportunity. Using certain elements that don't interfere with the original architecture, but kind of help accentuate it, and then bringing those elements inside. So it kind of draws you in and then brings you into the building. And then lighting, not just artificial lighting, but, or not just natural lighting, but artificial lighting. So using some really interesting globe lighting and creating kind of a field of light, if you will. And this is a project under construction right now in Eames Bluff. Really, this one's about the structure, which I'll kind of emphasize when I go through. So here's a section through it. You can see the roof planes are really complex. We have a roof that kind of ends here, but then we used steel ties to tie it into the rest of the structure. And so you can see some framing. Here's the framing, which I think is beautiful. Almost a shame to cover it up. They did a beautiful job on it. You can see those steel ties. This is from above. There's a loft that looks down. Just a really nice detail. And, like I mentioned before, steel is good intention. So it makes sense to detail this particular aspect of the building that way. And then just some basic details we use, kind of telling you about blurring the inside and the outside, how the glass goes into the ceiling, and the mullion details, and then how the glass dies into the stone, and then the floor and the countertops. Really kind of minimizing any obstruction between the inside and the outside. And I'll talk briefly about my house, because you don't have to live in a Fay home or any place fancy to be inspired or play with these ideas. And you all might be horrified by what I did, because I've changed it quite a bit, but it needed to be done. So this was a 1957 home. I originally thought it was just a farmhouse, but connected with the previous owner recently, and they said it was an orphanage, which I found quite interesting. But when we bought it, it was, lowered ceilings, felt really enclosed. The windows didn't allow a lot of light in. Really just a typical 50s house. But I love the bones and the shape of the house. So really wanted to accentuate that. So we removed the ceilings. This is the living area, so you can kind of see where it was. So here's the fireplace as it was. Here it is now. Pardon my Halloween decorations. That's not a real skull. But you can see that it exposes that construction brick, which has a really nice texture. Yeah, it's rough, but I like that about it. And then you can even see the original framing, which I also like. And then we kept cross ties and then trimmed everything out that was exposed, those framing members. And so you can really see the architecture of the place. And then all the windows were single pane, and there was no insulation in the walls, and the electrical and the plumbing all need to be redone as well. But you can see that when we replaced the windows, we created, I guess, a larger aperture in a way that allows a lot more light in. And I hadn't looked at these photos until recently, and couldn't believe how green this kitchen was. So yeah, that single window in the kitchen, like all the other spaces, a single light in the middle just won't do. And so we also raised part of the ceiling in the kitchen, like I mentioned before, kind of the idea of creating space, not from walls, but from details like this, like how do you treat the ceiling and how do you treat the floor. And then even just adding these pendant lights creates this beautiful shadow on the ceiling. I just can't get enough of. So that's not even natural light. But this house now does not have a single room without a window in it, other than the closet, which I love. Here was the bedroom, same case, low ceilings, single fan. We took some space out of one of the other bedrooms and put a bathroom in it. It was a 2-bath house. Now it's a 3-bath house. And so here's that bedroom now. We opened up that window quite a bit. It looks east over a pasture and a pond. It's really a beautiful view, and you can see the sunrise every morning. And then this is part of that bathroom we added. It's a wardrobe, one of the few custom cabinet pieces I got to build. But it's open at the top, so it allows light in. And then every now and then, if the hallway lights on, you get these really nice shadows. And then this is a trellis outside that creates a pattern on the brick, and then another one of my favorite spaces in that building. And then these are just random shadows. So, you know, I didn't design this house. I renovated it, but I draw inspiration from all of these things. And then here is your 10 seconds of Zen. All right, and that is it. I can't believe I talked for that long. Thank you so much for listening to everything I had to say. I hope we still have some people left on here.
You do. That was excellent. Thank you, Lori.
Thank you. I enjoyed sharing all the work with you. I hope everybody enjoyed it.
Yes. Yes, I'm sure they did. You've got one comment from Lisa Skiles. Legacy of Ideas was a great concept for this lecture. Thank you. Great talk. And anybody else who wants to type a question in for Lori, please go ahead and we'll take a couple. Oh, I see one. Oh, from Lily McCrae. Brilliant attention to detail and craftsmanship. Really enjoyed learning about Jennings and Santa-Rita architects and your projects. Thanks, Lori.
Thanks, guys. I don't know those people at all. I don't know Lisa or Lily. They're just, just kidding.
Yes, I know you are. Okay, Mary Jane Silva, thank you for your presentation. I especially enjoyed hearing the ideas behind the materials and use of lighting. So anybody else, please feel free to ask a question. And while we're waiting to see if any come in, I've got a couple. Lori, for everyone else who wasn't on here early, where did you grow up and how did you get interested in architecture?
That's probably not too much of an interesting question or answer. So I grew up in Fayetteville. My parents are actually from the Northeast. My dad came down here in the 70s and started teaching at the university. And so when I was in, I think it was junior high school, we had to build dioramas. I'm sure everybody remembers building dioramas. And so I built a diorama of the courthouse or the courtroom from To Kill a Mockingbird. And my English teacher at the time said that you should be an architect. And I had no idea what that was. And honestly, I'm still trying to figure that out sometimes. It's a job with many different aspects to it. But I looked it up and I thought, you know, I like these things. I like art. I'm interested in design. I'm really interested and good at math. So why not? I mean, let's just go that route and see what happens. And then when I graduated, I toured a few colleges, went to U of A, Rice, WashU, UT Austin. And I just loved the school here. It felt like home. I knew it was a really good program and I love Fayetteville. I always thought I would move away from Fayetteville, but the longer I'm here, the more I don't want to move away, especially since it's growing up so much. So, you know, an architect is one of those things, like if you don't really want to do it, if you're not passionate about it, you're not going to stay in the program. Or you're stubborn, or you're just like really stubborn, which I'm a little bit of both. I'm really passionate about it and I'm also really stubborn. So I stuck through it and I'm glad I did. And do you want to know why I'm even here? Like I have a story about being in this office too. I don't want to talk too much.
That was another question that I had written down is how did you get your foot in the door there at that firm?
Well, that's also not really an interesting answer either, but I knew the Jennings family. I grew up with Maurice and I'm good friends with Marcy Jennings. We actually rode horses together. We were cowgirls. So we would show up at horse shows and at different events and just kind of got to know each other. And so I knew about the family. I went to their house for multiple sleepovers when I was in high school and I'd stay in Maurice's house or in the guest house, which are, architecturally beautiful buildings. And so I really began to appreciate the work then. After my first year in college, I called up Maurice and asked if I could have a summer internship and he said they didn't have room. And so the next year I called him, I think I called him in like April or May, which, of course they didn't have room. The next year I called him in February and I said, I want to work for you this summer. Will you, give me an internship? And so I worked for him after my second year. And then I worked with him after my fourth year. And then I worked for another firm briefly after I graduated, but it's kind of at the beginning of the economic crash. So it was kind of a weird situation in general. And so I kind of pivoted towards more Maurice and Walter and called them up and said, I was looking for a change and if they were hiring. And so luckily enough, they, brought me back in, and that was in 2006. So I've been here for 16 years now. I love it. I mean, in the same office. Not much has changed.
That's great. Okay. I don't have anything else from anyone, but I've got one more. I've got lots written down, but I'll ask one more. You talked a lot about the firms and your focus on craftsmanship. And that's something that resonates with me as a historian and a preservationist, and just an overall person who appreciates architecture and design. And I love that you talked about the custom windows. I love that. But do you have difficulty finding the craftsmen to build some of your designs?
Yes, we do. Luckily, we have found a contractor or a couple that we work with in the area now that are used to our details. But a large problem is that if we send them out to bid, we call it the fear factor, and people will look at those custom details and they will jack up their price or say they can't do it. And they're different. They are different. They're not complicated necessarily. So yeah, that is a challenge. We are also working with the same steel fabricator we've been working with for decades now at this point, and he is just as obsessed with craft and detailing, if not more so than we are. And so that's a really great relationship. But the cabinets are another thing, the trim work, it's just simple milling, it's just millwork. But with the way people build now, it's, all these suburbs and just slapping up one house after the other, and it's just the same details, and you go buy the crown molding from the place and you don't really necessarily have to worry about the way things meet because you can cover it up with this, that, or the other. And so there's just like this, people are accustomed to that, and so kind of talking people through it is a large part of that job as well. Like, this isn't as scary as you think it is. And we work with glass manufacturers that understand the work as well. But we've also done storefront windows and Anderson windows and Marvin windows, and we do it all. But that is a big challenge in the work for sure.
It is. I know it is because we face the same thing with historic buildings. But I would argue, and I'm sure you would too, that it's built better.
It is. Yeah. I mean, they need to be maintained. I can't tell you how many Bay homes I've been into that weren't maintained. And, these details have also evolved over time. So, there were leaky skylights for a while and leaks around fireplaces. And so we've changed those detailing so that doesn't happen as often. But just like anything, it has to be maintained. But they stand the test of time, not just even the way they're built, but kind of also their style and their significance and how people enjoy experiencing them.
Yes. Well, I think they absolutely do. I loved seeing the buildings that you showed. So thank you again for your excellent talk. And remember that for you, those of you watching, that this is recorded on our YouTube channel, on Preserve Arkansas's YouTube channel. If you'd like to go back and see it again or share it with a friend. And make sure to join us on May the 10th for Secretary Hurst's presentation at 3:30. Thanks, everybody. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Bye, Lori. Thank you.